This is a video reply to Xnado on her 90s video that she did about everything that was great about the 90s, claiming to be a 90s kid. Now, there are a few good things I liked about this video, but the majority of stuff was either misleading, just plain out wrong, or forgotten about, wasn't mentioned. Now, I grew up in the 90s. I was born in 1987, so my entire childhood consisted of the 90s. That's what I had. I didn't have a choice. So let me inform you, the viewer, as to what actually was screwed up and what should have been mentioned. Xnado, you claim that you remember when Kurt Cobain died. You also claim that you were born in 1991. Now, the 1991 birth thing I do believe, but I do not believe that you remember when Kurt Cobain died. Because if you did, you would have been 3 years old. He died in 1994 in April. So if you do remember it, you have got a fucking good memory for a 3-year-old. Boomboxes were, they went a 90s thing, they were a 70s thing, and then an 80s nostalgia thing. So if they were a 90s thing, they were a 90s nostalgia thing. Because the whole thing was they were brought back in the 80s to make white guys look cool for black guys. It was a big rap thing, kind of like the East Coast and West Coast. You seem to forget that the SNES system, the Super Nintendo, was brought out over the course of 1991 to 1993. So if you actually did own one of these, then you must have been a really outdated kid, because for a new gaming system for someone of your age, when you're old enough to actually play games, would have been the Nintendo 64 or the PlayStation 1, or if you waited a little while and you were lucky, you may have gotten yourself a Dreamcast before they were taken off the market. The wax on, wax off thing, I really appreciate this. That was a good movie, but it was from the 80s, not the 90s. The 80s. New Kids on the Block, or I think they called themselves NKOTB when they were reinventing themselves as, tough gangster rappers for all the kids. No one ever liked them. They were always bad. Always. Always. The internet. Now, you claimed that the internet was never around before the 90s. It's been around since the 80s, man. There's a couple movies, a couple documentaries that actually mention this. One of them, I think, there's a movie called Hackers, which is with Angelina Jolie, and she mentions that about 5 times. And if you Wikipedia it, you'll probably find out that it's been around for a while. You mentioned a couple of TV shows. Let's see, there was Full House, Hey Arnold, I can't remember the rest, Power Rangers. They all sucked. Trust me, I was a kid and I hated them. They sucked ass. You should have mentioned the good ones around the 90s. Good ones like Angry Beavers, Daria. Daria was fucking awesome. And Beavis and Butthead. But you would have been too young to understand what the jokes and everything was about. I miss MTV back when they actually played music. And Cops in its prime. These are the first early years of Cops. Now that was fucking awesome. I loved Cops back then. At the end of 1999, you would have been a maximum of 9 years old. So you're really missing out on what happened. Let me fill you in on what happened. The big, actual 90s events. The first Gulf War happened with the other Bush. Pretty messy. Princess Diana dying. That was in France. And that was a lot, that was really over the news back in, I think it was 96 or 97. The impeachments. That big mess with Clinton. You know, how he, it happened and then he denied it. And then eventually he owned up to it. Of course, if you have a look at Monica, I don't blame him. I would have lied about it too. The recall of push pops, those little, they were like lollipops that you could stick on your thumb and you push them down, that lollipop would come out, and then they took them off the market because some kid cut his tongue off with one of them. Eventually they put them back on the market, but it took a while. The Nesquik banana flavor recall, they had to do a recall on these because they found out that a little bit of the Nesquik ingredient, especially in the banana flavors, can cause cancer for kids. Going along with food, there was also the Pop Rocks and Coke myth. That was huge in the 90s. I think that actually started about 93, 94. when some kid died from doing it. It haven't really been that many deaths since. Yo-yos, that was pretty cool. You remember yo-yos? I do. For about, they were cool for a week maybe. The introduction of Windows 95. Now this was a huge thing. Then they did Windows 98, and then Windows 2000, and Windows Me, and then Windows XP, but XP didn't happen till afterwards. But I remember that the 95 version was huge. Apple pretty much said, oh shit, we're screwed. And nothing really improved until they brought out OS X. The US airstrikes on Kosovo. Now that was a huge thing. I remember hearing about that daily. When France was doing nuclear tests off the coast of New Zealand, they were blowing up stuff and everybody was really getting down on them, and the UN was having this huge spiffle with them. The Columbine massacre. Now that changed a lot of things. Luckily I'm in Australia, so I never actually had the pleasure of going through metal detectors on my way to school. The Pokemon fad. Now, admittedly, I never really liked the TV show as a kid, but I loved the Game Boy games. They were awesome. If I still had my Game Boy, I'd probably play them. The introduction of actual heavy metal. Back when AFI were punk, before the whole emo scene came in and destroyed everything. I miss those days. Those days were awesome. When Run DMC split up, that was big. The 1996 Atlanta Olympic bombings, that was pretty huge. I remember hearing about that and actually watching it as it happened. When global warming was actually called global warming and it wasn't called climate change, and scientists researched it instead of getting paid to try and make it seem as if it wasn't our fault. So, if you're going to make a video about growing up in the 90s, make sure your childhood was actually in the 90s. From the birth date you've given everyone on YouTube, you grew up in, not really the 90s. You were born in 91, so your childhood didn't really start until at least 94. So it would have been about 94 through to 2005. You weren't a 90s kid. You just seem to clutch onto the stuff that was in the 90s because it seems cooler now for some reason. I don't know, retro's back, which really pisses me off.